The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
In a little more than a decade, Jason Kander has gone from the Missouri State House to Missouri statewide office to national prominence. And now the former Democratic official is talking about his work with the Veterans Community Project, an organization that is committed to ending homelessness among veterans. Kander joins us next on Politically Speaking to talk about his work with VCP and a whole lot more. So let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
It's a little complicated in Bolivar because there is a Parsons family there.
But we also knew that it was important to make sure that we got to where we needed to go.
You know, if you walk in a room and you're getting ready to make a decision and everybody in the room looks like you need to stop.
And right now what happens in the United States Senate is as critical as anywhere else in the country.
I really want the state to succeed.
Well, we want everybody to know that we're all working together.
I just worked hard to try to build my name where I didn't have the money.
Hi, everybody. This is Jason Rosenbaum, a political correspondent with St. Louis Public Radio. What you're about to hear is a conversation I had with former Secretary of State Jason Kander, and this was a special edition of the podcast that we streamed live on Twitch. There's a couple production notes that I want to just get out of the way. You're probably going to notice that my audio is a lot different from the very professional sounding audio from Kander. That's because there were technical difficulties on our end, and I had to use the audio from Zoom on my end. There may be some instances where I'm talking and he interrupts where that audio doesn't sound the same as his. It's not a huge deal, but I wanted you all to understand what was going on there. Without any further ado, here is Politically Speaking with Jason Kander.
It's been about a year since you joined the Veterans Community Project. And for people that are not super familiar with what it does, I want to give you a minute or two to explain how this organization is trying to eliminate homelessness with veterans.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity. So Veterans Community Project was founded by a handful of my fellow combat veterans. I'm not one of the co-founders, but I've been with the organization, like you said, for about a year. But about 4 years ago, it was started by this group of combat veterans in Kansas City, guys my age, who looked at a couple of things and said, I think we can do a better job. One of those things first was just that there were so many loopholes in the services offered for veterans at the federal level, at the state level. And they said, I think we can do a better job. And so they went out and they started delivering services directly to veterans. I mean, a lot of people assume that when you walk into the VA as a veteran, that you sort of say, I'm here, and they look you up and you're in the system. And that is how it should work, but it's not how it actually works. And in fact, about 30 to 40% of the people that we all would consider veterans, people who wore the uniform, served their country, are not considered veterans by the federal government. So they're not eligible for VA services anyway. And so they looked at that and said, boy, that's a big problem. We can fill in that gap for a lot of people. And so they created an outreach center that just pretty much whatever veterans need, they walk in and VCP, Veterans Community Project, hooks them up with it by using volunteers from the community. Could be people who want to help them with legal issues. Could be, mental health professionals. Doesn't matter. Dentists, whatever. That was the first part. And that was going really well. They served thousands of veterans in the Kansas City area. And then they looked at it and said, boy, there's also this huge problem with veterans homelessness. And why is it that cities and states and the federal government can't seem to crack this problem? Well, it had never really been tackled at the local level by combat veterans themselves. And so they got into it in a really interesting way, a way that makes a lot of sense. They went out and they talked to homeless veterans. And what they were trying to figure out was, why were there so many beds in homelessness facilities open and at the same time, so many homeless veterans still on the street? And the backdrop to this, by the way, is that cities were declaring victory over veterans' homelessness through this little trick called functional zero. And what that is we got, for instance, 100 empty beds and we got 100 veterans homeless in the street. Because of the empty beds, we're declaring victory over veterans' homelessness, which is obviously ridiculous. So they went out and said, why aren't they using these? And what they found is a lot of them have things like post-traumatic stress. They have other issues related to their service, and they don't feel safe sleeping in a shelter in an open environment around people they don't know. Now, before I got therapy for post-traumatic stress, I couldn't sleep on a plane because there were strangers around me. So this makes sense to me. So the plan they came up with in talking with homeless veterans was a village of tiny houses that sort of replicates base housing and then, recreates the last time that a lot of these folks were successful and stable. And that's what they did. And so they created a village of about 50 tiny houses in Kansas City. Cut to a few years later, between the outreach services and the village itself, Veterans Community Project has pretty well eradicated street homelessness among veterans in Kansas City. And so I came on as president of the organization to focus on national expansion, and that's what we're doing, which I'm guessing leads to your next question, which I will not jump on. You can go ahead and ask it.
Well, okay. Yeah, you kind of jumped the gun in my next question.
It's all right. It's a segue.
It seems like you're getting good at this podcasting thing. You seem to have a little bit of experience with that. I am aware that you are planning, your organization is planning to come to St. Louis. There has been a bill that has been introduced to the Board of Aldermen to buy a plot of land in the 18th Ward, which coincidentally is where my great-grandparents owned a grocery store back in the day.
That's cool.
Clearly, that's the reason that you chose the 18th.
Yeah, we did our research.
I want you to talk a little bit more about that because I think people in St. Louis would be definitely interested to hear that your organization is coming here.
Well, from the very beginning of this push for national expansion, St. Louis was a natural fit for us. I mean, it's across the state. It's obviously for me, I know a lot of people there, and so since y'all keep a lot of voters there, I've spent a lot of nights there over the last decade. And so that's something we wanted to do. And so we looked around, we found a really good for us piece of property that was owned by the city. It's LRA or whatever it is, land bank is what we call it over here. But that sort of property combined with a couple of private spots. And then the next step was working with so we agreed on it with the staff at the city, and now the Board of Aldermen has to vote to actually sell it to us, which, you never say anything's over, but we're confident about how that's going. So when they come back from recess, they'll vote on that. The backdrop to all this is that we got really creative, and there's part of the medical marijuana law that was passed says that a good portion of that funding has to go to veterans organizations. And when they had a large surplus of money come in license applications, we went to the governor and to the Veterans Commission and to folks in the legislature like Senator Nasheed and said, what do you think about some of this going toward the construction of a Veterans Community Project village in St. Louis? And we were able to make that happen. So the next step is the Board of Aldermen sells us this land, and then after that, we'll go to the Veterans Commission, and then they'll, presumably actually appropriate that money that's been put into the budget and appropriate it to us, and we will use it to, it'll be part of what it costs to build the village there. It's the first time we've ever taken public funds. Usually we can't take any because they usually come with strings attached, and they don't allow us to, serve our clients the way that we want. For instance, most of the time, they would force us to turn a lot of veterans away because a lot of federal grants only serve, veterans who, for instance, have a certain kind of discharge, that kind of thing. So in this case, this will account for, roughly 30 to 40% of the funds that we'll need to do the project. So we will raise the rest through fundraising in St. Louis.
Well, that was going to be my next question about the impact of you joining this organization. And this is going to come off as an overly flattering question, but I think
that's my favorite kind. Let's do it.
But I think that there's some backstory to this. I think when you announced publicly that you were stepping away from electoral politics to deal with your mental health issues, it created an overwhelming reservoir of goodwill. And whatever you were going to do next was going to get a big reaction. So whether it was going to be like you running for something again or joining an organization like VCP, it was going to get a lot of attention. And my question is, have you seen an impact of you joining VCP, increasing the amount of money coming to the organization, increasing fundraising? I know you don't want to take all the credit yourself because it's an organization that has a lot of people, but I am interested in the impact of you joining this organization, increasing not only the visibility of this issue, but also bringing in more money for you to actually accomplish your goal.
Well, look, I'm confident that I've provided a lot of value here, right? And that I continue to. And it's like everybody in their job, that's what they want to do. And I'm fortunate that I get to do that. Look, it's interesting. For me, first, let me tell you the backstory of how this happened, which you're familiar with, but folks listening may not know. When I made my announcement that I was going to step back from everything and go to the VA and get treatment for post-traumatic stress, I went to the VA at the time I made the announcement, and I found that, like a lot of people find, that there was a lot more, there were loopholes that I was following through. In my case, not that it matters, but in my case, it was that the rule was that if you came in within 5 years of your combat deployment, then you would be enrolled in the system, no questions asked. But after 5 years, you had to go through this really big process, and it takes months to prove up that you needed the services, which, by the way, is ridiculous and backwards because trauma doesn't get better with age. It's not wine, it gets worse. But that's the problem I ran into. And I'm a person who I could not possibly be in a better position to navigate this process, right? I mean, I got a phone full of influential contacts. I got a law degree from Georgetown, and I got some pretty high government experience, pretty high level government experience. But I was, overwhelmed by the process. So I called Brian Meyer, the co-founder and CEO of Veterans Community Project, who is a friend of mine, but who I had just toured VCP as a guy who was going to be mayor 6 weeks before. So I called him. I'm like, what do I do? And he's like, come on in. So I went through the outreach center, just like any of the other thousands of vets in Kansas City. And they, helped me with my paperwork, expedited the process. And within a very short time, I was in weekly therapy at the VA. And it obviously went pretty well for me. So several months later, when I was doing a lot better, I was hanging around VCP a lot because I found the place so inspiring. I was volunteering a bit. And Brian said to me, hey, look, everybody wants us to come and replicate what we've done in Kansas City in their community. We hear from everybody around the country, but we don't know how to build a national organization. We've never done it, but you have. Do you want to just do it here? And I was like, yeah. So I jumped at the opportunity. So that's how I ended up in this role. Now, to get to your question directly, it's interesting because for the first 6 or so months of my doing this, I found that most people made one of two assumptions about what I was doing. The first was, and the more common one, was that VCP was some sort of holding pattern, some sort of spot for me to hang out until I ran for the next office or got appointed to something in Washington or whatever. And then people who didn't assume that, or people who I disabused of that idea by saying, no, that's not what I'm doing, assumed that I was in that place where a lot of former politicians are, which is like a cash-in spot. So I started to get offered like these, board positions or stuff that was like basically sounded like lobbying to me. And what I would tell people is, look, you don't understand. This is me cashing in. Like, I understand that I have this large network of donors and elected officials across the country, and that I'm fortunate to know a lot of people who are well known. And I'm choosing not to do that just for myself. I'm choosing to cash in on that for homeless veterans and for others. And that's because, look, in a lot of ways, this is part of, I guess you could say it's part of my therapy, but it's really just, look, I went over to Afghanistan in the first place feeling like if I do my job well, I can help some people get home safely. And probably like most combat veterans, I never really felt like I successfully did that. And look, who knows? I could have done any number of things and probably never felt that way. And this job, actually, the first time I ever started to feel that way is when I found out a few days after my announcement that calls to the VA crisis line had tripled nationally.
I said this publicly. I think that your announcement saved lives because people, you mentioned before, and I would say this if you were a Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever. You have a large national following based off your U.S. Senate bid. There are a lot of people that look up to you. And there are a lot of people that were going through depression and PTSD and didn't know what to do. And they probably read your letter and saw the national coverage, and they went to therapy, and they went to get help. And I think it also destigmatized, people that are seemingly successful can come out and say, I'm going through this too. I mean, I've said this publicly too. I've been going to therapy since 2016. I have like what I would consider functioning depression at times. And I think I've had some PTSD symptoms based off reporting in Ferguson too. I'm not trying to say that as a way of like one-upping your issues. I'm trying.
No, it's good to say that publicly. It helps people.
Exactly. So I just wanted to interject there that I can't really quantify that, but just based off what you said, I have to imagine a lot of ordinary people that saw that announcement were affected by that and got help because of it.
Yeah, look, it's the most important thing I've ever done. And I wish that everybody who went through treatment had the privilege that I've had of getting to not just hear from thousands of people through email or social media, but meet people in person who say to you, you saved my life. It means the world to me. And when I first found out, I was staying away from any news reporting on the story at first because I was just trying to focus on treatment and not on how the story was playing. But my wife did tell me one morning, about 2 days after the announcement, she said, I'm reading the story and it says nationally calls to the helpline tripled. And I started crying, and I told her, this is the first time I've ever felt like I helped some people come home safe. And so this job for me, to finally get around to answering your question, the reason, yes, I have this profile and I have this sort of currency of notoriety or whatever, the reason that it means so much for me to use it for this and to cash in for this cause is that I get to help people come home safely every day. That's what we do. And it's all I ever really wanted to do.
Well, I want to talk about a couple of issues that I think are happening right now with the issue of veterans homelessness and ones that are going to come in the future. One is COVID-19. I know that there's been a lot of talk amongst advocates for the homeless about how homeless people are especially vulnerable to COVID-19. I'd be interested to hear how your organization has been dealing with that aspect of this public policy issue.
So the homeless population can't self-quarantine, right? They can't stay home. They don't have houses. And you don't have to just think about this as for the homeless population, but let's start with how it affects the homeless population. In order to receive the services that homeless people typically receive, they have to physically go to a bunch of places during the day. And I think a lot of people don't understand that being homeless is a full-time job. You have to be in line. If you want 3 squares a day, you got to be in line at 3 different places early, 3 times a day, on time. And then if you want to have shelter overnight, you got to show up at that place at a certain time. So there are places you have to be. And when this pandemic first started, most of those places, especially when testing wasn't remotely available, weren't able to accommodate quarantining people. So if you had any kind of symptoms or if you tested positive, they couldn't provide you services. And if you're homeless and you can't get those services, then you don't eat and you may sleep in a very dangerous condition or place. So what that forced homeless people to do in many cases was to either pretend they didn't have symptoms or refuse testing, because if they did that, they'd be in a bad spot. So when you consider that, on top of the fact that we serve the homeless veteran population, we realized in Kansas City, we could not exclusively serve homeless veterans during this pandemic because they were part of the homeless population. So we needed to jump in and start serving all homeless. And so in typical military leader fashion, our leadership, our CEO jumped in and said, hey, we're available to do this. And so in Kansas City, he and a couple other folks led the response citywide to homelessness and to folks on the brink of poverty during the pandemic. And it made a real difference. Now, the other reason that this has to be thought of is not just for the homeless population, but for all the rest of us. If you don't jump in and treat the homeless population really well during this pandemic, and you don't handle this situation for them, then it doesn't do anything to contain the spread, because those homeless folks are covering the same ground as us. They're around a lot of the people in our city. They're transient throughout the city. So as a result, you can emerge from quarantine and be exposed to people who may have been infected in this homelessness community the whole time. We're fortunate in that because of our tiny house model in our village, no one in our village in Kansas City has tested positive for it, but they were heavily affected by the economic side of it. We've had about 80% layoff of the folks in the village from their jobs, which is a shame because we had gotten folks from 25% employment when they came in on average to 95%. But they're really resilient because we can't have outside volunteers in right now. They've just volunteered to step up and do it. So they're taking care of all the normal stuff that volunteers do.
I want to talk about the economic part that you alluded to, because there is an impending eviction crisis that's going to affect lots of people across a whole strata of different demographics. And I have to imagine that in the next few months, when hundreds of thousands, if not, maybe small millions of people lose their access to their apartments, a percentage of them are going to be veterans. And my question is, how is your organization preparing for what could be an influx in demand for tiny houses or the services that Veterans Community Project provides because of this impending a wave of evictions?
So there's something in homelessness called EAF, which is emergency assistance funding, and it's something that we do a lot of with our veterans. And it's it can be as simple as somebody comes in and lets us know that their car is about to be repossessed or they're about to get evicted. It is one of the most common ones, and we're able to give grants, $250, $500, $750, that kind of thing. And it oftentimes is the difference between somebody becoming homeless and not. The best way to fight homelessness is to prevent it. And so what we have been doing is we have been, in anticipation of this problem, we've sort of ramped up our fundraising for our EAF grants, because we anticipate that there is, once we get on the other side of the freezes on utility payments, the freezes on rent payments, that kind of stuff, and on the other side of these stimulus packages that have come out, we expect that there will be an influx of that sort of thing, and we want to make sure to prevent it.
So a listener from Maryville, Missouri asks, what can Kansas City and St. Louis do to improve housing opportunities for minorities and veterans? And I guess maybe you would answer, give more to your organization, hypothetically. But I think that the problem requires more than just the Veterans Community Project to cultivate affordable housing, not only for the homeless population, but for low-income workers as well.
Yeah, look, it's basically a question about housing policy. And here's how I think about it. It's that it all comes down to what we consider affordable. There's been this big debate in Kansas City over the last couple of years about it. And look, that's a luxury. And it's not a luxury. Luxury is not the right word. That is a mark of Kansas City sort of hitting the spot that a lot of other cities have hit before us, which is when you are successful and you have economic growth, oftentimes you are going to run into a housing issue. And the question is, are you going to take the prosperity you're experiencing and make sure everybody has a chance to experience it? That's really what a lot of the housing issues are about. And so it just comes down to how you what you consider affordable. Oftentimes people look at it and say, okay, it's affordable if housing costs 25 to 30% of the median income. Well, all right, except median income is not covering what it once did, right? And also people have expenses that are more than they used to have. So if you've got student loans that are accounting for 10% of your income and you're at median income, and food costs more than it used to, wages are not what they used to be. Certainly minimum wage doesn't cover anything. Childcare is way more than it used to be. I think the answer to this question is we've got to change our way of thinking about what is affordable. I think, frankly, affordable when it comes to housing is probably a lot less than 30% of median income. We have to work to make that much lower. And how does that translate into policy? Well, when you're doing things like giving tax credits for affordable housing, when you are subsidizing land as a municipality and saying, we're going to subsidize the development of this piece of property and you have to do 20% affordable housing. Well, we got to change what we mean by affordable so that more folks can actually afford it.
I want to shift gears to elections because, as I mentioned on the outset, you were Secretary of State for Missouri, which oversaw elections in the state. You were part of a group called Let America Vote, which advocated for election policy before you transitioned into the Veterans Community Project. And the specific thing I want to talk with you about is the whole debate over expanding mail-in and absentee balloting. And I want to start this off with an observation of mine and a pet peeve of mine about this whole discussion, which you're more than welcome to disagree with, but I want to get your take on this. I have been really dismayed by the way this issue has been framed linguistically. And initially when COVID hit, people were talking about expanding, quote, mail-in ballots. which I thought was way too simplistic to describe this issue. And I understand the reason you want to use a 2-word or 3-word phrase as opposed to, expand the availability of absentee ballots or create a system where election authorities proactively mail ballots to people. But I feel like using the term mail-in balloting made it seem like we should shift to an Oregon, Washington, Utah, Colorado model where we proactively send people ballots as opposed to, making absentee balloting more available.
Well, I think we should shift to an Oregon, Washington, Colorado model. And I thought that well before the pandemic. I mean, Oregon has not only the highest voter security in the country, they also have the highest turnout. And it's not an accident, right? Think about the world we live in. As I've been sitting here, I've gotten little notifications on my phone letting me know that packages have arrived on my doorstep.
And as have I was asked by my wife to make sure that my son got to daycare.
Exactly. Right. No, but I mean, like, I've been getting notifications on my phone that 2 packages have arrived just in this conversation. These are packages that I ordered yesterday. That's the world we live in. And I'm not talking pandemic. I'm just talking about all the time. That's the world we live in. So if we live in a world where you and I can go online and order something and have it show up at our house sometimes the same day, right? If there's a movie you can think of, you can go downstairs and find somewhere on your TV where you can pay $4 to rent it right away. You don't got to go to Blockbuster, right? So that's the world Americans are walking around in. So it's not surprising that they have an expectation of not standing in line for 2 to 4 hours on election day in order to vote, not missing work in order to vote. And there's no reason in the world why they should have to do that. We should, in government, aspire to deliver the same level of customer service that everybody else does. And it's incredible to me that the Republicans, a party who claims that they want to do things like business and et cetera, that they have no interest in providing any level of customer service to people. Now, what are the things that you have an opportunity to provide customer service to citizens? What are the things where everybody's doing the same thing around the same time? It's like when you pay your taxes, and voting and maybe a couple other things. So why not take those opportunities to do a really good job? So that's what we ought to do. Now, as for the pandemic just exacerbates the problem and just says, look, a lot of people don't feel safe going in to vote, so we should do everything we can to make it more convenient. And so that's how I see it.
Well, I understand the desire to implement a principle. The whole other question is actually executing that principle. And from reading some articles about the Secretary of State of Washington, who's a Republican, but also oversees a system where voters are proactively sent ballots, she said that it's going to take a couple of years to actually create a system and an infrastructure for states that don't have that in order for it to work effectively. Yep. So, for example, it's unlikely like a state like Missouri could shift to a Oregon-Washington model right away.
No, I totally agree. And Kim Wyman's the Secretary of State in Washington. She's a friend of mine, and I do have some Republican friends. People might not think so, but I have several. And she's right. That's why this is something we should have done a long time ago. So what should we be doing right now for states that don't have it? We should be making absentee voting, like you said, far more available and much easier. That's what we should do. And here's the problem. You have a lot of Republican secretaries of state, most who are not like Kim. And so they don't see it as their job to make voting more accessible and make voting an easier experience for voters. They don't view voters as customers. They view them as criminal suspects because they want to vote and they find that suspicious. And so as a result, you've got a two-tiered problem here. The first is you've got to get the federal funding from Washington down to the states, which a lot of work has been done, and some of that federal funding has happened to allow states to adjust their system, which is just a matter of, in some cases it might be mailing out ballots, but that may not be possible in a state that hasn't done that. So then it's just accommodating for the fact that there's going to be a lot more absentee ballots, and you're going to consider the pandemic an excuse, which it should be considered one. Well, you're going to have more absentee ballots, and you got to accommodate that, and you're going to need the staff to cover it, that kind of thing. So that funding is required for that. But then the second part of this is there's no guarantee that states with chief election officials who are Republicans are actually going to use the money for the thing that the federal government said they should. There's tons of money in a lot of states sitting in accounts that was for election administration that Republican election officials are refusing to use to make the system better. And so we have to do two things. We have to keep pressure on Washington to allocate that money, and then we have to apply pressure at the local level to actually use that money to make the system work the way it should.
I think that one pressure point that may be causing some Republicans to not embrace this idea is the president. The president has been talking on Twitter about how he thinks mail-in balloting, I'm using that term again after I criticized it.
Well, don't be bothered. The president thinks that absentee ballots and mail-in ballots are two different things. He tweeted out the other day. He said absentee ballots are fine, mail-in ballots are a problem. They're the exact same thing.
I understood, even though there's difference in ways of whether it's proactively sent or whether you have to request. But the whole question about whether there is fraud with absentee balloting, I'm going to be candid with you. That's been a discussion here in St. Louis long before Trump. There has been, we talked about this in 2016 with the state rep race, where a Democrat accused another Democrat of absentee ballot fraud. So this insinuation that absentee balloting has fraudulent elements to it is not a new phenomenon. And I want you to address that, not only to respond to the president, because I'm sure you disagree with him on that, but just, people that may assume that it could create a system that has corruption involved with it.
Well, let's start with, I'll just quote my predecessor as not my immediate, but one of my predecessors as Secretary of State, a Republican, Matt Blunt, who, when he tried to expand mail-in voting or early voting in Missouri, his argument to the legislature at the time was that it cuts down on any risk of fraud because it decreases the possibility of confusion on election day, and that the only way someone's going to really pull off any kind of fraud is if there's a lot of confusion and chaos on election day. And if there's fewer people, shorter lines on election day, then it's just a lot harder to pull off fraud. And I think he's right about that. But let's also just keep in mind that statistically, as an American, you are more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to commit voter fraud. It is exceedingly rare. There's been, out of like however many hundreds of millions of cases of people voting in this country, there's been like less than 200 convictions for voter fraud. So, I think you're more likely to get pardoned for a crime that was a conspiracy you did with Trump than you are to actually commit voter fraud statistically in this country. So we should keep that in mind. And then what we should remember is this: like, honestly, the real, where the president spoke the real truth is when he said, and this isn't true, but it's what he really believes and it's his real motivation, is when he said, if we allow people to vote by mail, then Republicans will never win another election. Now, he's wrong about that. It doesn't help or hurt either party, but that's his real motivation, is he believes that. And the reason he believes that is because Republicans, not all Republicans, not the Republicans listening to this, but Republican elected officials who craft the strategy of the party decided like 30 years ago that when more people vote, it's bad for them. And they literally bring this up as an argument against, early voting and that kind of thing, as if the fact that they think it's bad for their party's chance to win is an actual policy argument. It's not a policy argument. This is about power. It's not about anything else.
Yeah, you could make an argument. I'm going to use the Missouri example. There are probably people that live in outstate Missouri that live far away from their polling place that would probably be more willing to use absentee ballots if they were more available. Those people aren't going to vote for Joe Biden. They'll probably vote for Donald Trump. And I'm sure that there would be more people in St. Louis, Kansas City, St. Louis County that would do the same thing. I don't know. There's no data that says that, but it may just even each other out basically and not really have an impact toward anybody. That's just my back of the napkin analysis of that.
Oh, there are Republican operatives all over the country right now who are trying to sound the alarm to national Republicans that, hey, we win elections in our part of this state because people can vote absentee and vote early and vote by mail. Please stop telling people that it's not Republican to do that because you're going to kill our chances. So it's ridiculous, and look, at the end of the day, it doesn't even matter whether they're right or wrong. Like, we shouldn't have to argue about whether it's true that more Republicans or more Democrats vote by mail. It shouldn't matter. If the statistics said that more Republicans vote by mail than Democrats, I would still be for vote by mail. Do you know why? Because I think my arguments on everything are better. And so I just want everybody to vote. Like, put everybody in the jury box, and we'll put on our facts and you put on yours, and we'll kick your butt. That's how democracy is supposed to work. When I was Secretary of State, I worked really hard to make us the best state in the country for military and overseas voting. Now, look, military ballots, most polls will show you that military ballots tend to skew conservative. And I knew that, but I did that knowing that I was going to be on the ballot for one of those elections. But it doesn't matter, because my job was not to make it easier for Democrats to win elections. My job was to make it easier for Missouri voters to vote. And so that's what I did.
We'll be right back after this short break with more from former Missouri Secretary of State Jason Kander.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
So I want to shift gears to the protests decrying police killing Black people across the country. And I want to talk with you about this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's important for white journalists to talk to white politicians about this. This should not just be questions that are, posed to Black elected officials, because, we need to talk about this openly. But number two, I've followed you for a long time, and I've mentioned that on the outset. I think that you have probably a different perspective on issues of racial equity and civil rights than other Missouri-based politicians. I know that in 2014, after the uprising over Michael Brown's death, you started a fund to help Ferguson businesses. I went to a press conference where you were surrounded by Black politicians, and you said Black Lives Matter in 2016, which apparently was like a difficult thing to do back then.
Yeah, I guess so.
I think the protests have been happening now for about a month and a half. And I think the shift is going from people should be protesting this to, hey, we need to actually do something on a personal and policy level. And I'm interested to hear what your perspective of the next steps of these protests for police accountability are.
Well, look, it starts with recognizing the fact that an awful lot of our politics, an awful lot of our culture, and an awful lot of our race or our history is about race. I don't know about you, but where I grew up, I was taught a completely different history about the Civil War. I was taught that our heroes locally here in Kansas City were supposed to be the James Younger Gang and Quantrill's Raiders. And these are all Confederates. I live in a place that there's monuments around my house that this used to be the farm of somebody who went to fight in the Confederacy. And that's like celebrated by these monuments. So we just have to get real about the fact that this is all around us, and it always has been. And to your point, it is important for a white journalist to ask, white political leaders about this, because this is not Black people's problem to solve. Every time I hear somebody say something like, well, look, and it doesn't even have to be on the issue of police reform. I've been seeing this for years when we talk about doing things for the urban core in St. Louis or Kansas City. And one of the first go-tos of not just Republicans, but just white politicians and all sorts of leaders, white leaders, is, the Black community and Black leaders really need to step up. Man, they have been stepping up for years. They're stepping up way more than their counterparts on the other side. But look, without capital, there's only so much stepping up you can do, right? You could have everybody do absolutely everything. But if there's no money spent in that community by anybody other than Black folks, well, then they're not going to get very far. And so I just think we got to get real about that kind of thing. And I don't know, I got pulled over the other day because I was going like 8 miles an hour over the speed limit. And the whole time I was thinking about the fact that I wasn't remotely frightened and that I had no reason to be. And I got off with a warning, and the guy was super nice and super courteous. And I'm not saying that if I'd been Black, he automatically would have, treated me differently or been unprofessional. I'm not saying that. I am saying that if I had been Black, I would have been frightened of that happening. And I think about my my good friends who, like me, are fathers, and they happen to be black and they happen to be raising black sons. And I think about all the things that they have to think about every single day that I don't have to think about. How they don't buy their kids water guns because they're afraid that if their kid, who may be a kindergartner, by the way, is carrying a water gun in their neighborhood, they might get shot. How they have to tell their kids, don't ride your bike into other people's driveways because they're afraid they might get shot. Whereas I taught my son, you can get more momentum if you're not good yet at using your brakes by going into the driveway and turning around. Like, everything about your life is different if you're not white in America. And we, for years, have been saying, like, well, what are black people going to do about it? Well, you know what? They're doing everything they can. It's our job to do more. So I'm open to everything that we can possibly do on this.
Well, you mentioned like what my experience was. I mean, both of us are Jewish. I'm a Reform Jew. I think you're a Reform Jew too. And I was taught by a lot of people, being my relatives, about the good of racial equity and the good of civil rights. My mom went to Little Rock Central High School, the first integrated high school in the South. My stepfather was in Mississippi summer in 1965. And I was told all this about like how righteous civil rights was while I was living in a predominantly white neighborhood in suburban Chicago and went to a predominantly white high school, and hung around predominantly white people at the University of Missouri, Columbia. And even though this was always in the back of my mind, I don't think it never really came in my face until Ferguson. And I was covering that on a semi-daily basis for a year. And when you hear black people tell you how they got a gun pulled on them when they were trying to get a loaf of bread, and you hear that type of story over and over again, you don't walk away from that experience without it affecting you and without those things you were taught as a kid being more center. I don't mean to make this overly personal, but
you should. That's how we change people's minds.
But for you, as a person who shares a religion with me, did your experience growing up Jewish affect your view of civil rights? I'm really interested to hear your opinion on that.
Certainly, culturally, it did. I mean, in the sense that I have that same sort of history in my family. I mean, there was a real tradition. Tradition. There was in this country. There's no doubt that American Jews saw a lot of solidarity, and still do, I believe, with any other people that are being oppressed. And so, my great-grandmother went to NAACP meetings, and so absolutely. But it doesn't even take that. I mean, for me, I think a lot of it, like most things with me, come from a combination of the way I was raised by my folks, and also the military. And that is that when you're in the military, the people you serve with are your family, and they come from every possible background, and they have every possible color about them. And so that really helped me see that I'm not different than any of those people. And look, you want to talk about white privilege. I'm famous because I made an ad where I assembled a rifle blindfolded. If I were black, do you think that would have gone the same way? You think if I stood in a warehouse with a blindfold on and very sort of menacingly assembled a rifle and then challenged my opponent to do the same, even a lot of liberals would have looked at that and said, that's glorifying gun violence. That looks violent and angry. So we are awash in white privilege. And the only way this is going to change is if we start making the case to other white people that this is our responsibility. I mean, look, it is exhausting, I think, to be confronted with this all the time when you are on the receiving end of it, for black folks. But I also do understand, I'm not saying it's okay, but I understand how if you have been unconsciously, as many white people in this country have, of all political stripes, unconsciously benefiting from white privilege and from having this basic advantage in your life, then everybody being included feels like exclusion to you. And we've just got to keep hammering away at this until people understand, no, that's what equality actually is. You're not losing something. We're just making it fair.
Well, there was a reason I talked about my particular situation, because there's probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that feel the same way, who are white, who are like, well, I'm not racist. I had experiences where my family fought for civil rights, but they don't really actually do anything in their personal or professional lives to actually stand behind Black people that are being marginalized, whether it be in the workplace, whether it be in politics, whether it be in policy. And I wanted to ask you, like, what can those types of people do? Many of them who probably listen to you all the time and are probably going to vote for Joe Biden, but are probably trying to figure out, I've never had to actually step aside from my white privilege and actually do something hard. So what would you suggest that those people should do?
Well, I was super encouraged by how many people turned out to protest. I was just so encouraged by the fact that there were so many people who were like, I have to go and be one more body during this, right? And I think that's where it starts. And then after that, it's about not allowing this to be something that we only talk about and we only work toward when something like George Floyd happens, right? Because we don't only talk about climate change when there's a hurricane. We talk about it all the time because it's a problem all the time. Racism is a problem all the time, particularly if you're not white. And so we have to think about it in every single thing we do. When we do housing policy, we have to put it forward. When we do, no matter what the policy is, every single thing we do in policy, the question has to be, what are we doing to take into account the fact that systemic racism exists in this country, right? I mean, every time I see a publication do one of those lists of the 40 under or whatever, I think about, did they actively think about, are we representing what our town looks like as a whole? Because people will frequently say things like, well, we only got so many applicants. I'll tell you what people can do. Anybody in a hiring position, here's a mistake I used to make. When I was Secretary of State, we really wanted to have more minorities in the office. And we did a pretty good job. I mean, we had way more than I think anybody had. But when we first got there, it was difficult. And at first, our instinct was to offer the excuse of, well, being in Jefferson City, you don't get that many applicants for this. Okay, yeah, we could have stopped there. And initially we did. And then we figured out that was wrong. That was systemic racism, saying that, it's not our fault because we just went with the applications we had. No. If you're going to be anti-racist, then you got to go recruit. You got to go into the Black community and say, I really want to hire people in this community because I know it'll make my office better. I know having those perspectives will make my office better. So if you are in any position to hire, it is not your responsibility just to give every consideration to, for instance, African-American applicants. It is your responsibility to go make sure that as many Black people as possible apply for those positions. And why is that our responsibility? Because just like you mentioned a minute ago, we're a very segregated society. White folks tend to know white folks and Black folks tend to know Black folks. And so if you are, and how do most people get jobs? They get jobs usually through somebody they know. No matter the job, it tends to be they hear about an opening because of somebody they know. Well, that's systemic racism, and you gotta do everything you can to break out of it and make sure that it's not just the people you tend to know and the people they tend to know and the people they tend to know who know about this job opening. You got to go meet new people.
You also got to recruit them and also offer them money.
You're right, and the opportunity for advancement, and the opportunity to be in leadership, because you know what? It's really good when the people doing your hiring are people who know other Black people. And by the way, we should talk about it this plainly. This thing where we got to code word it and we always got to talk about, well, we want to make sure we have diversity. Yes, say diversity, but also say what you're doing. Go to a Black church and be like, I don't have enough Black people at my company. And I think it means that, and by the way, you don't have to do this out of charity. Do it because Black people are also customers, man. You want to sell whatever your product or your service is to everybody? Well, you probably ought to have everybody represented.
Well, let's get into some of the questions that we have from listeners, and we're going to keep on this topic. Do you think it's time that we have a Black statewide elected official in Missouri? Now, interestingly, there was a Black person that tried to run to succeed you, Robin Smith, and there were frankly a lot of complaints along Missouri Democrats that she didn't get the same type of money or organization that white candidates got from the Democratic side. I know that you were focused on your Senate race.
No, but I tried to help Robin as well, but yeah, I think it's a legitimate complaint. And yeah, we absolutely need that. We need that for the same reason that we need that because a whole lot of black people live in this state and they deserve to be represented. And by the way, like, not only do we need a black statewide official in Missouri, or like several of them, on top of that, it's why I believe so firmly that Vice President Biden should pick a running mate who is a black woman. And here's the thing, when I say that, what people like to do is they say, well, I just think he should pick the most qualified person for the job. Here's the deal. Black women have been criminally underrepresented in this country for ever. And as a result, when you look at who is the best person for the job, who is the best person to have a voice in the White House and lend their personal perspective, it's a black woman. And so a black woman is the most qualified person for that job, just as a person of color is one of the most qualified people for any statewide position, because that population is criminally underrepresented.
Well, actually, that was, again, you're excellent at segueing. Somebody who submitted a question ahead of time of who do you think Biden should pick as a running mate and why? And I think that there's several black women that have been floated. Kamala Harris of California, Karen Bass of California. I also know that Tammy Duckworth has been floated. She's not a black woman, but she's an Asian woman from Illinois. Do you have anybody in particular that you would want Biden to select?
No, because I think I try not to do too much of the unsolicited advice thing for people that I like publicly, for people that I actually know. And so I've gone kind of as far on that as I want to go by just being like, I think it should be a woman of color. But, there is no shortage of outstanding candidates. I mean, today, I'll plug my podcast, Majority 54. The new episode dropped today. It is the first episode where we've had a third co-host, like a guest co-host, and the co-host is Stacey Abrams, who would be tremendous, and I believe will be president one day. And so, look, I said this back when he hadn't said I'm picking a woman or whatever, and people were asking me, like, are you interested in being his running mate? And I was like, no, it should be a woman of color. So I firmly believe this.
Well, again, you're excellent at segueing. Another person asked, would you accept a Biden cabinet or other leadership role? And there's several other questions like, are you going to run for office?
Yeah. Why don't I answer all those together here?
Just do it now. Let's rip the band off.
Okay, cool. So first, no, I don't think so. Probably not. In terms of will I accept a position? And it's just, and look, I think Vice President Biden's great. And I'm going to work quite a lot and have been to make sure he's elected. But in terms of, am I going to run for office again? And do I want to be in the cabinet and all that? Look, here's the deal. I spent a decade of my life thinking about what I would do in the future, because that was a whole lot less painful than living in the present, because things were not internally going well for me and they were progressively getting worse over the years. And so when that's happening, one avoidance strategy is to just really focus on the future. And I also, had this enormous hole that needed to be filled, which is common to trauma survivors, which is a need for redemption. And I felt like I could achieve that. I wrongfully thought I could achieve that through accomplishment and that kind of thing. Now, I also did this stuff because I love my country, so I don't want to completely take credit away from myself. But the difference in my life now is I'm enjoying the hell out of my life. I really like it. I coach my son's little league, when we're not in a zombie apocalypse, and he's awesome. And when school is actually happening, like, I take him to school every morning and pick him up every day. I do a job I love. I still have a pretty prominent voice in the national conversation. And so when I care about something, I can step up and I can move the debate a little bit. My wife and our relationship is amazing. And like, we live in Kansas City, which my son's a 6th generation Kansas Cityan. I love it here. I work out 6 days a week. Like, my life is really good right now and I'm enjoying it. And so the answer to this question is, I used to say, well, I'm not really thinking about that right now. Because that's what you say when people ask you if you're going to run for president or whatever. I'm not really thinking about it right now because I'm just having a really good time. And so when Vice President Biden wins the presidency, and I believe he will, and I hope he will, I'm sure that if I wanted to reach out and discuss, all number of opportunities there, I'm sure that that'd be a conversation people would be willing to have. And I bet also personally that there will be moments when I'm watching people settle into new jobs and the excitement of a new administration. There'll be moments where I have pangs of like, oh, it'd be cool to be a part of that. But they're going to be pretty momentary because I just don't want to move, man. My life is good and I'm enjoying it. And we love this house, and it's like life is good and it's just that simple. So will I ever run for office again? Right now, I have no desire to do that. But I can't say that I would never have a desire to do that again. Maybe like when my kids are grown or whatever, when my kid is grown.
You're only 39 years old.
Right.
You don't have to give up on doing something now. Apparently 39 is like middle age now, but for American politics, it's pretty young.
Yeah, man. So long answer to a short question, but but can I also say about this though, that the other way people ask this is, are you ever going to come back? And my answer is like, dude, I'm back. I'm in public service. I'm helping run a major national nonprofit. And by the way, I have a weekly podcast that's like pretty popular where I help shape the debate on national politics. So like, I'm pretty sure I'm back. And I do I headline like 4 Zoom, political events around the country a week, which I can't believe people attend those, but they do. And so I'm back. I'm not putting my name on a ballot. I'm still back.
Rab Stuff asks in our live chat, how do you approach the idea of electability when talking about potential political candidates? Often I feel like it's a code word for running white candidates in places like Missouri. And I'm going to take this a step further. We've talked about black candidates. I said before, I'm Jewish. I see how I don't think that there's like a well of anti-Semitism in Missouri politics. That was a discussion after Tom Schweik's death. Very uncomfortable discussion for Jewish people that are in and around Missouri politics like us. But, when Jake Zimmerman ran, I saw whispers about unelectability, and I wondered if that was a code word that he looked too Jewish. And I'm sure that that's happened too with black candidates too. I don't mean to be super blunt about that. I know Jake is running for office right now, but I noticed stuff like that, and I'm sure you've noticed stuff like that too. I'd be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, well, look, there's 2 kinds of electability. There's legit questions of electability, which are questions about as a candidate, do they present well, right? Are they good on TV? Are they, this is a profession and it has a skill set that goes with it. And then there's questions about electability that are code words. And with those, look, that's cowardice. And the reason that it is because the only way that just like anything else in the world is going to change is if we just charge forward. Speaking of Stacey Abrams, she gave an answer recently I think she was on Colbert or something. And I loved this answer. She was asked, why is it that when you are asked, do you have any interest in being vice president? Do you have any interest in running for president one day? You just answer the question, and other politicians are cagey about it. And she said, look, 1, that's how I am, which is true. And 2, and I loved this part of the answer, she said, look, my entire life, people who looked like me, and Stacey, I think even said, she's like, I'm a dark-skinned black woman. She said, people who looked like me were not thought of as somebody who could potentially run for vice president or president. And so as a result, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And she said, so I have 2 reasons why I do this. 1, I want people to start thinking about people who look like me as someone who could run for that because I may want to run for that. And I need them to get ready for that in their mind. She said, and 2, if it's not me, it's going to be somebody else. And I have a responsibility to get people used to thinking about people who look like me as people who can be in positions of leadership. So we all have a responsibility to put forward, everybody for this stuff because, the more people who serve in those roles or who run for those offices, the more folks can picture somebody like that being in that job, whether they win or not.
2 more questions for you. Mary the Nerd asks on Instagram, do you have any advice for young people, mainly college students, who want to get into politics?
Sure. I'll give two pieces of advice. One is for anybody who has gone away to school, and that is go home. Don't think that just because you went to Washington or New York or Chicago or wherever you went, that therefore you made some major life accomplishment. You're needed at home. And one of my personal hobby horses is to convince particularly folks in the Midwest and the South to go back home and be of value in their community, because there's something special about home. That's the first piece of advice. The second, and particularly if you want to be in politics, like, it helps to go back where you're from. The second piece of advice is don't think that you're going to go work in politics in a way that's like, you're going to go in. I mean, I always joke that anytime anybody came in to volunteer and the first thing they did was say that they could be a good speechwriter, I knew that they weren't serious, right? Like, don't go in and think that whatever your skill set is, that you're going to immediately use that. No. If you want to be in politics, whether you want to run or whatever, show up at campaigns that you care about and do whatever they need and what is of value to them. If what they need is for people to clean toilets at campaign headquarters, then be the best at that anybody's ever been. If what they need is for people to put stickers on a bunch of yard signs, then commit yourself to that task. And at some point, whatever it is that you're also good at, they're going to need that, and they're going to appreciate your dedication. The other thing about that is, don't get into politics to be something, get into politics to do something. And that means don't immediately just get into politics. Do a lot of things you care about. And if you do that in your community, you'll get to know a lot of people, and you'll get to know them in a way that's not, hey, I'd like your vote. You'll get to know them in a way that comes with a lot of credibility. And then when you're ready to run for something, and maybe it'll be soon, a lot of people who can help in that process will already know you as somebody who they found to be helpful and genuine, and that'll make a difference.
Okay, the last question, because we're at 11, we're at an hour long, but this is the most important question I'm going to ask. Jeff Mazer, also known as JMaz USA, what's with the stuff you're eating? Sweet potatoes and sardines, cottage cheese with taco sauce. Real snacks are just a reoccurring online bit.
I love Mazer. Shout out to Mazer. Hi, Mazer. I will give a semi-serious answer to this, which is, as part of my mental health journey over the last almost 2 years now, I've also made big changes in my physical health, and I had the opportunity to do that because as my mental health improved, I was able to think about my physical health, and that's really contributed to my mental health. So for the first time in my adult life, I have a hobby, and that hobby is fitness. And I just started, I've become one of those annoying people who reads about fitness all the time. And I feel like it's sort of like I have this new toy, because for a long time I had these injuries, like back problems and stuff like that from the Army. But what I didn't realize is they were really mental health stuff that was, my body was communicating with me. And now that I don't really have those problems so much, it's like I have this new toy. I'm like, wow, I wonder what else my body can do. What other crazy physical challenges can I take on? And as part of that, about 6 months into that, realized, I should probably put the proper fuel in my body. So I've gotten really into reading about nutrition. So now, I eat 6 small meals a day, and not because I'm trying to have my metabolism be better. It's because your body can only, it turns out, absorb certain nutrition so much at a time. And I have come to eat very healthy, and I tend to eat just about the same thing every day. And so I started to post a little bit of that stuff, and people love to hate on your food choices. It's like their favorite thing on social media. At one point, I think I posted a shot of my bedtime snack every night, which is cottage cheese and either hot sauce or pepper, depending on the night. And I got, no joking, Jason, I got 1,300 replies of people just that is the word, you're a horrible person, And so then I was like, well, do y'all just want to see what I eat every day? So in my Instagram story, I just did every meal of that day. And my social media, following on Instagram went up 20%. So people claim they hate it, but they don't hate it. So the answer is, it's not a gimmick. It's not a bit. I'm that annoying person now who knows everything about macros and pays attention to all that stuff. And it's a hobby.
Well, Jason, I just want to really say thank you for this conversation. As I mentioned on the outset, I feel really honored to have been able to watch your journey through politics and now out of politics. And again, I would say that to a Republican person too, that I followed the whole time. This is not a partisan thing. And I'm really happy that you are feeling good mentally. As I mentioned on the outset, that's something that I think is really important to destigmatize and talk about. And before I let you go, I want to give you a chance to not only promote your organization where people can find out more information, but also give a little bit more promotion to your podcast, which, as you mentioned before, is very popular right now.
Thanks, man. First of all, I want to thank you. You know, it's funny you said the thing about 2007. I realized, yeah, like we have known, we're getting older, man. We've known each other for 13 years. You started, I think actually one of the very first media interviews on video I ever gave was a video. It was an interview that Stephen Weber and I did about our military families bills that we filed when we were freshman legislators. And it's funny, I watched that not that long ago. It's a video you took, and like I'm in this terrible suit, you know, and like
I didn't ask you if you were serious about running. I asked Weber that because he was 25, and I thought someone running as a 25-year-old was a gimmick.
Well, Weber was running in Columbia, Missouri, where there's so much media, it's amazing. And I was in Kansas City, where, you know, you had to really fight to have anybody care at all what you were doing as a state legislator. So, because there were so many of us. But anyway, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to plug those. Thank you. So, Veterans Community Project, folks can go to veteranscommunityproject.org. A really great way to support us right now is if you go there and you click on shop, we have actually some really good, I should have brought them with me for this live stream, masks. And for every one that you buy, we give one to a veteran, and they're really good. They're made by Charlie Hustle here in Kansas City. And then, so we do rely almost entirely on private donations. So I appreciate people doing that. And then for my podcast, it's called Majority 54. You can get it wherever podcasts are downloaded. I had it, a couple years ago, and at that time it debuted as #1 in the country. It unseated Oprah as #1. And now we're back, and it's really gratifying to see that the audience is pretty much still there, but we're still in the process of making sure everybody knows that we're back. So Majority 54, it stands for the 54% of Americans who voted for somebody not named Donald Trump. And the whole idea of the podcast, it's a little different than others, is it's to equip those of us who did not vote for Donald Trump to have meaningful and persuasive conversations with the people in our lives who did vote for him, and have them about the most divisive issues in the country, but without losing those relationships or alienating those people from our lives. So that's what it's about.
You can download that by searching Majority 54 on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. You can find all of our stories on stlpublicradio.org. You can't really follow me on Twitter right now because I'm in Twitter jail. So you can follow me at J Rosenbaum USA, which is my alternate account. And you can follow Jason Kander at Jason Kander. He's also on Instagram. He's a social media sensation. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've done enough flattering of you for now.
Yeah, this has been great. Anytime, man.
Thank you very much. And until next time, so long.